Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another recorded lecture of anatomy and physiology. Today we'll be talking about the spinal cord and the peripheral nervous system. And the book covers the spinal cord in chapter 13 and the autonomic nervous system in chapter 15. What I'm going to do is combine the most essential concepts from chapters 13 and 15 and make it a very short lecture. We can go into a lot of detail, but because A, we're not meeting in person, and B, we're actually running out of time, I'm going to make it a bit abbreviated compared to what you might normally dive into. And if you're going to take neurology or some kind of a neuroscience class in the future, you'll definitely learn a lot more about the peripheral nervous system. So this is going to be a basic overview of the bare essentials you need to understand. So let's start by defining what the structure of the spinal cord is. So here we have the spinal cord, and the spinal cord itself is a cylinder of nervous tissue. It's basically just a hollow tube of nervous tissue, and it extends from the foramen magnum at the skull, the base of the skull. So here is that hole, that foramen in the skull, where the spinal cord protrudes out of, and it goes all the way down right about to L1. So this is the spinal cord, and if you wanted to measure it, it's about 45 centimeters long. There are branches called spinal nerves. So we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Each of these is called a segment. So each of these is called a segment. So every pair of nerves is in a segment, and they're numbered according to the vertebrae that they emerge from. So we have C1 through C7. We have T1 through 12. And then, of course, there's nothing that goes, just spinal nerves emerge. The spinal cord ends before L1, but spinal nerves still emerge from the lumbar vertebrae going posteriorly. So we have some protections so we don't damage the spinal cord. And just like the brain had skull bones to protect it, as well as meninges, we have vertebrae bones protecting the spinal cord, as well as the same type of meninges, those connective tissues that protected the brain. And before I go on to the functions of the spinal cord, right, just notice the again, the curvature and how the spinal cord fits inside of the vertebra. Right, and think about, what do we call that hole? So you could pause on that. What do you call the place where the spinal cord goes through? So you can pause here and tell me which part of the vertebrae the spinal cord goes through. So the vertebral foramen is the big space where the spinal cord can go through. And I have a picture coming up of that in just a second. So that's the structure of the spinal cord. Hollow tube of nerve tissue goes from the brainstem all the way down to about L1. Spinal nerves protrude outward in sections, and the spinal cord is protected by meninges and the vertebrae because the spinal cord goes through all the vertebral foramina. And the functions of the spinal cord are very important. So the spinal cord can transmit and integrate nerve impulses to the brain and from the brain. So what that means is messages from throughout the body can be sent to the brain via the spinal cord. So if there's a message coming from the leg, it has to go through a spinal nerve to the spinal cord and then to the brain. The spinal cord can also integrate many separate messages coming from throughout the body or even from outside of the body and integrate that message before it sends it to the brain. So it's called neural integration because the spinal neurons are receiving input from lots of different sources at once. So it has to basically figure out what's the right action to take place and what's the appropriate time for it. There also the reflexes that we require for normal functioning are controlled by the spinal cord as well. So reflexes include our posture reflex. So like when we're off balance, we automatically kind of regain our posture. Or if we trip and fall, we could automatically stand up straight. We also have some reflexes that are for protective responses to pain or injury, and we'll speak about those in a bit. One other important function of the spinal cord is how it helps us in locomotion and movement. So when we walk, it involves repetitive, coordinated contractions of lots of different muscle groups in our limbs. And while our brain has the motor neurons that can initiate walking, there are certain groups of neurons in the spinal cord that produce the sequence of outputs to the muscles that cause the alternating movements of the lower limbs. So the spinal cord helps conduct information, it helps integrate that information, it helps with reflexes, and it helps us move. So let's take a step back. We spoke about the brain in chapter 14. And the brain is completely enclosed by the skull. So how does the brain, if you were in the brain right now, it would be completely dark. It would be dark, it would be silent, there'd be nothing inside. So how does the brain know what's going on? Or how is the brain going to perceive what's going on in the outside world if there's no input to it, right? It's enclosed. So it turns out that we have these special nerves, right? We have the peripheral nerves that can transmit information from the outside world via our senses, right? So we can sense things via our eyes, our nose, or our tongue. Those nerves that connect our eyes, our nose, and our tongue then go to the brain. And if I touch something in my fingertip, how is that message going to be perceived in my brain? It's quite far away. All right, so how does that message get from my fingertip all the way to my brain in a millisecond? So we have special spinal nerves, right, that extend, there's a message that goes from my fingertip to my spinal cord first, and then from my spinal cord to my brain. So the spinal cord is almost the intermediary, right? It's still central. It's the central nervous system, but it's an intermediary between the spinal nerves and the peripheral nervous system and the brain. Right, so the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, consists of cranial nerves and spinal nerves that connect the central nervous system to various parts of the body. So like I mentioned, nerves help transmit information about the internal body and the external world to the brain. So for example, we have receptors inside of our body that monitor how hot it is, how hot our blood is at all times. And then it will tell our brain how to modulate the temperature accordingly. We also have sense organs like our eyes. So if I see a wolf, then that message will be sent to my brain. My brain will then interpret that as a wolf, and therefore it's dangerous, and therefore I'm aware of what's going on outside of me. So my sense organs and sensory receptors, which are part of the peripheral nervous system, and all of the cranial and spinal nerves kind of feed information into the central nervous system so that it can decide what to do. Right, so the spinal cord communicates with the rest of the body by way of spinal nerves, and the brain directly communicates to the body by way of cranial nerves. So let's just look quickly at these protective structures. So here is the body of the vertebra. This is the spinal cord that's sitting inside of the foramen and the vertebral foramen. And so this is the posterior, this is the spinous process. So if we were to look in here, the center is, this is the spinal cord. So here's the spinal cord. And right outside of the spinal cord, we have that pia mater, which is the very thin, delicate membrane. Pia mater. And right outside of the pia mater, we have the arachnoid mater. And in between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, we have the subarachnoid space. And that's what's filled. This is the subarachnoid space in blue. And that's what's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And then we have the most firm connective tissue called the dura mater. The dura mater is very thick. The tough membrane, it's about as thick as a rubber kitchen glove. So it's multiple layers of dense, irregular connective tissue. And that then fits into, there's a space around it called the epidural space. And that has a lot of blood vessels and adipose tissue, other connective tissue. And you might have heard the word epidural because sometimes anesthetics are introduced into the epidural space to block any pain signals during childbirth or surgery. So it can, if you put it directly into the epidural space of the spinal cord, it could temporarily kind of paralyze you from feeling any pain. So it's called an epidural anesthesia. So again, this is the protective measure. And then out of these are intervertebral foramina on the sides. That's where the spinal nerves come out of. Okay. So the spinal cord is continuous with the brainstem. And just like the brain, the spinal cord has gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is in the middle, kind of looks like a butterfly. I'll show you more about that on the next slide. And this gray matter are where the neuronal cell bodies are. So it's gray because there are very few myelinated neurons. Just the cell bodies are in the gray matter. And that's where the information is processed. That's where synapses are formed. So you have dendrites and cell bodies over here. And then you have on the outside white matter, which are the myelinated axons. And the axons are going to carry signals from one part of the central nervous system to another. So the white matter could transmit information from one segment of the spinal cord to another, or from the spinal cord to the brain, vice versa. And also note this central canal. That's where the cerebrospinal fluid will flow all the way down through the spinal cord from those ventricles in the brain. So you don't have to know these. I'm going to skip through this. This is the gray matter. Really quickly, there are anterior roots of the spinal nerve in front. So these are two anterior roots, the anterior root, and then you have a posterior root. This anterior root carries only motor fibers, so telling muscles to move. This is the anterior. The posterior root carries only sensory fibers. So information coming to the spinal cord goes through the posterior. Information coming from the spinal cord goes to the anterior. And you have, in some of them, you can't really see it in this one, but you have lateral horns as well. So within this butterfly, you only see posterior horns and anterior horns. So these are anterior horns. These are posterior horns. And again, these posterior horns in back carry only the spinal nerve. They carry only sensory fibers in these two posterior horns. The anterior horns carry motor fibers. So you don't have to know that for the exam, but it's a little more information. So we said the white matter surrounds the gray matter in the spinal cord. And the white matter consists of bundles of axons that course up and down the spinal cord, providing communication between different levels of the central nervous system. And this is a two-way street. So there are some tracts that are ascending. But that means ascending tracts carry sensory information up the spinal cord to the brain. So ascending tracts take information from throughout the body to the spinal cord and sends it to the brain. Descending tracts do the opposite. Descending tracts carry motor information. They conduct motor impulses down from the brain. So they carry motor information to the body. So if I prick my finger, is an ascending tract or a descending tract going to transmit that information to my brain? Right, the ascending tract. And what if I want to start walking? How is that message going to be sent to my legs? Right, that's the descending tract. So I'm going to skip this, but an example of an ascending tract, remember we said ascending carries sensory information from the brain. So the brain has to be aware of, for example, let's use this example. The brain has to know if I just touched something very hot. So I have heat receptors throughout the body. Those neurons, those sensory receptors would connect to the spinal cord, to an interneuron, that would then communicate through the medulla to the midbrain to the cerebrum, finally to the somatosensory cortex and the postcentral gyrus. And if I felt something in my leg, for example, that I burned my leg, it will light up the portion of the somatosensory cortex that corresponds to the leg. So you don't have to know these specific names, but I want you to understand how the spinal cord communicates with the brain. So the spinal nerves are what connect the CNS to the PNS. And we have 31 pairs or segments of spinal nerves that branch between the spinal cord, from the spinal cord between the intervertebral foramina. Right? In between here, the spinal nerves kind of come through each pair. This is the lateral view. And we name these, sometimes these are grouped in plexuses. These are kind of groups. So this is the cervical plexus, the group of cervical spinal nerves. And here is an actual spinal cord that's been dissected. And these are the spinal nerves. So you can see these are the nerves, how they come out of the spinal cord. And you can hear this is an example of the posterior root and the anterior root. It's a little hard to see, but this is the dura mater. This very thin stuff is the arachnoid mater, and you can't see the pia. So what is a nerve? We keep on saying the word nerve, but what actually is a nerve? A nerve is a bundle of axons surrounded by connective tissue. So think about a nerve fiber, think about an axon as like a nerve fiber. So a nerve fiber is the same thing as saying an axon. And these axons are surrounded by connective tissue. So a nerve is like a cable with many wires. If each wire is like an axon, a nerve is a cable with many wires bundled together. Right? So this bundle over here, this is a bundle of axons. This is one nerve fiber. This is one axon. So when they're all bundled together, this whole thing is a nerve. And there are multiple bundles within a nerve. So you should be reminded a little bit of a muscle, because these are very similar vocab terms, actually. Right? Muscles are muscle fibers that are bundled together in fascicles. Very similar idea. So we have these axons that are wrapped in Schwann cells. Those are the myelinating cells. And these are bundled up in connective tissue. And these bundles are packaged in more loose connective tissue that contains fat and arteries and veins to help nourish the nerves. And the cell bodies of these neurons are elsewhere. So these are just the axons. The actual cell bodies are somewhere far or are elsewhere. We'll talk about where they are. They're in ganglia. They're in ganglia. And I'll show you that on the next slide. Nerves may have motor and or sensory axons. So it's not just a one-way or one-type street, right? So you can have information in a nerve that's telling the brain what's going on with the body, or you can have a message coming from the brain telling something to the body. So sensory or afferent nerves carry signals from the sensory receptors of our body to the CNS. So they're telling the brain what's going on. Motor or efferent nerves carry signals from the central nervous system to muscles and glands. So this is our brain telling our body what to do. And most nerves are actually mixed. They have both types of signals. They have afferent and efferent fibers in the same nerve. Within a nerve, you also have specialized glial cells and connective tissue, fat tissue, and blood vessels, so we can nourish, support, and protect those axons. The sciatic nerve is the largest nerve outside of the spinal cord. It's about the diameter of your pinky, so it's very large. And some nerves are very long. So the vagus nerve comes from the brain, but it innervates your organs of your respiratory system, your digestive system, and your cardiovascular system. So the vagus nerve has a lot of control over your body. So a ganglion is a singular cluster of cell bodies, of neural cell bodies or neurosomas that are outside of the CNS. So the spinal cord is part of the CNS, but we have these roots. We said there's a posterior root ganglion. And the posterior root ganglion is associated with spinal nerves. And this is where all the cell bodies are stuck. So here's another posterior root ganglion. These are where all the cell bodies are. Because we said the white matter contains a lot of these axons too. So how does information get to the spinal cord, and how does information get from the spinal cord? So we have information coming in here to the spinal cord, some sensory information. So let's zoom into this little box over here. So information from the body is leading into the spinal cord, and it goes through this ganglion. This is where all of the somatosensory neural cell bodies are. So the information goes from the sensory nerve fiber. The cell bodies are kind of out of the way, and then it feeds into the posterior root of the spinal cord. information from the anterior root, right, motor information, will then go up here and can then tell the receptors what they need to do, how they need to move. So information this way is going to the spinal cord, right, telling the spinal cord what's going on in the body. And then information in green is going outward to the peripheral receptors of the body. But what I want you to understand is that these are just axons. The cell bodies themselves are in clumps called ganglia. Here's a little fun fact. Shingles is actually a result of a virus that's stuck in the posterior root ganglia. So chickenpox is something that we've all had. It's caused by a certain virus, the varicella zoster virus, that is usually not very complicated, just produces an itchy rash. But the virus remains for life in the posterior root ganglia, and the immune system makes sure it doesn't leave the posterior root ganglia. Shingles is a result of when that virus travels down the sensory nerves when it should not. So when the immune system is compromised, it can't keep that virus inside the posterior root ganglia anymore. So it escapes. And it goes to sensory nerves by axonal transport. And this causes a very painful trail of skin discoloration. That's painful and that itches a lot. So this is, again, a result of when the immune system is not functioning at its best. The virus can escape and wreak havoc once again in older age. So which of the following is not a function of the spinal cord? So pause here. The answer is A. So we just spoke about how the brain communicates with the rest of the body by the way of the spinal cord. But it also communicates by way of 12 pairs of cranial nerves. And these cranial nerves branch mostly from the brainstem, and they exit the cranium through its foramina, and they lead to muscles and sense organs in the head and neck mostly. We said there's an example of the vagus nerve that goes a lot farther than just the head and neck into the thorax. But cranial nerves interact with the brain directly, right? They skip the spinal cord. These cranial nerves may be either sensory or motor, meaning they can communicate information from the brain to the muscles. So there's muscles, there's let's take an example. The optic nerve, let's take an easy one. The optic nerve allows us to see. So that's a sensory nerve because we're perceiving something from the outside world. That allows us to perceive. It's a sensory. The oculomotor nerve allows us to move our eyes. So the oculomotor nerve is predominantly motor. So that's an example of it could be either a motor function or sensory. Most of them are kind of mixed. So a lot of these cranial nerves have mixed functions of sensory and motor. Only cranial nerves 1 and 2 for smell and vision are purely sensory. All the other cranial nerves have both afferent and efferent fibers, so they're mixed nerves. So functions that are carried out of the cranial nerves include our sense of smell, sight, hearing, taste, and balance. So you do not need to memorize the names of all the cranial nerves for this class, but you should know that the sense of smell comes from the olfactory nerve, which is cranial nerve 1. So we name these cranial nerves with Roman numerals. So our sense of smell is cranial nerve 1. So these are neurons that connect our nose to our brain. So do you think this is sensory, mixed, or motor? Right, that would be sensory. And then our sense of sight, right? That's the cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve. That's also sensory, right? It helps us see. Our eye movements, we said, are controlled by the oculomotor nerve, as well as also the trochlear, the trochlear nerve. Cranial nerve 4 also helps with eye movement. Let's go to the trigeminal nerve. The trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5, helps us perceive touch, temperature, and pain from our upper face. So the trigeminal nerve helps us perceive pain and temperature. That's a sensory. It's a sensory nerve. So that's so movement of eyes, we said. So these are movement of facial muscles, tongue, chewing, and swallowing. So again, these would be more motor and mixed. So the facial nerve has a lot of functions. The facial nerve helps our facial expressions. It helps us secrete saliva and tears and mucus. It also has a sensory. So the facial nerve, which is cranial nerve number 7, facial nerve is also responsible for taste. So again, these are sensory and motor functions all mixed that are helping our brain tell our face what to do, mostly, and our senses telling our brain what's going on. Those are the cranial nerves of the peripheral nervous system. And the cranial nerves here are shown in yellow, right? In this view, you can see here's optic nerve 1. These are all olfactory nerves. These are optic nerve 2. Sorry, the cranial nerve 2. It's the optic nerve. Then you can see here, this is oculomotor nerve, which has been cut. Cranial nerve 3. Then you have the trochlear nerve, trigeminal, abducens, the facial nerve, vestibulo-ocular, the glossopharyngeal, the vagus nerve, which is a very important nerve. We have the accessory nerve and the hypoglossal nerve. Those are the cranial nerves. And I like this picture a little better because it tells you which are sensory, which are motor, and which are mixed. So you should know at least 1 or 2 examples of one of these nerves. You might be asked, what is an example of a cranial nerve and what does it do? All right, you should know at least 1 example of a motor function of a cranial nerve and at least 1 example of a sensory function of a cranial nerve. So now we'll talk about reflexes. So reflexes is technically spoken about in chapter 13. And a reflex is an unconscious stimulus response action of the nervous system. These are all quick, involuntary, and stereotyped, meaning it's everyone does it the same. They're all fast and involuntary. They're stereotyped, so it's all the same in everyone. And their goal is to protect us from harm. So we have reflexes that keep us from having accelerated heartbeats or too high blood pressure. So some reflexes keep us in homeostasis. Those are called visceral reflexes. And that's more spoken about in chapter 15. Those are visceral reflexes. But we also have somatic reflexes that involve skeletal muscles. So these reflexes help us maintain our posture to keep us from falling over, and they keep us from harming ourselves. And all reflex pathways require very few neurons. They require very few neurons. They're very simple. And these pathways are called reflex arcs. So a somatic reflex employs a reflex arc, which talks about how the signals travel. So I'll talk about a reflex arc very, very soon. But I want you to understand now that a reflex is a stimulus response. So in response to a stimulus, there's a predictable response that is very quick and involuntary. So reflexes can be autonomic, like visceral, or they can be somatic. So autonomic or visceral reflexes act on smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, adipose tissue, and glands to help maintain homeostasis and body functions at an unconscious level. So that's spoken about more in chapter 15. Somatic reflexes act on skeletal muscle. Right, so they involve the somatic nervous system, and these are controlling the actions of skeletal muscles. So we're aware of these happening. So we're consciously aware of our somatic reflexes, but we do not have conscious control over them. That's an important distinction to make. And before I talk about these reflex arcs, I want to quickly mention these muscle spindles. So on our muscles, we have these spindles that are stretch receptors, and they're built into the muscles. So we have special receptors called proprioceptors that monitor the position of our muscles at all times. So these muscle spindles, based on how the muscle is oriented, the muscle spindle can tell our brain how long the muscle is, how contracted it is, where its position is. So the muscle spindles send the information about the muscle through the spinal cord to the brain, and the brain can then send motor information back to the muscles to tell them how to fix their posture or their muscle tone, or how to correct the reflex, or how to correct the movement by a reflex. So these muscle spindles are built-in receptors into our muscles that constantly communicate with the brain to tell the brain where we are in space. And the brain can then communicate back to the muscle to tell it how to adjust its tone so we can have the proper posture or perform the correct activity. So now let's talk about the somatic reflex arc. So we have sensory neurons. Like I just mentioned, those can be built in to the muscle, or it can be like a pain receptor in our finger. So we have a sensory neuron in our muscles, our skin, our tendons. So a sensory neuron first has to detect some kind of a stimulus. So in this case, let's take an example of I pricked my finger on a tack. So a sensory neuron in my finger detected a painful stimulus in my hand. That sensory neuron, remember, the cell body, actually I'll go back, I'll talk about this in a second. So the first neuron is this sensory neuron that goes from the finger to the spinal cord. Once that message gets into the spinal cord, there's an interneuron in the gray matter of the spinal cord that integrates the message and quote unquote makes a decision. So this interneuron will communicate with this motor neuron, and this motor neuron will then send a message back to the muscle telling the muscle to contract so it can move the hand away from the painful stimulus. So take a second to review this three-part process. And what's missing here? Right? The brain. The brain is not involved in any of this. We have a sensory neuron, an interneuron, and a motor neuron. The brain is nowhere to be found. And this is the whole point of a reflex arc. We don't care. The brain doesn't even need to be aware of what's going on. We just want to move our finger away as quickly as possible. It's actually a disadvantage to take the time to tell our brain and to think about moving our hand, right? That would maybe cause us to bleed more or cause more damage. We want to move our finger away from the tack as soon as possible. We don't even care about realizing what it is until we move our finger away. So the no brain is required, just the spinal cord. Shortly after you move your finger away, then your thalamus will get the message and sends it to the somatosensory cortex. So you'll feel the pain in your finger. And your limbic system will be made aware of that. You might have a little heart rate increase because you just hurt yourself. And your frontal cortex is then going to understand, oh, okay, I left that tack out. I just pricked myself. This is pain. Maybe next time I should be better. I should clean up after myself and I won't hurt myself again. So then you learn from that. I want to also just point out, this is the ganglion I was talking about, the posterior root ganglion. That's where the cell body is of this sensory neuron. And we call these unipolar neurons because they have their cell body outside elsewhere, right? So you have this is one long axon. This is the interneuron that's only in the CNS, it's only in the spinal cord, and the gray matter specifically. Then that communicates with a motor neuron that will go through the spinal nerve down to the arm, and it will cause the biceps to contract, which will allow us to recoil away from the painful tack. So this is a good animation to review. Here's the sensory receptor. You get that painful response. There's that posterior root ganglion. So I like this because you can control. So here you prick the finger. When you prick the finger, that message is sent to the sensory receptor, goes all the way up to the spinal cord. Note this is where the cell body is. Then it goes to the gray matter, interneuron integrates that information, sends it to a motor neuron. That motor neuron will go down to the anterior horn and then go to the effector organ, which in this case is a muscle that needs to be contracted so we can move our finger away. The patellar reflex is one that you've all seen in a doctor's office many times. So this is a way to check for neuronal health. You want to make sure that your neurons are functioning properly and you have a proper reflex. So this is an example. This is called the patellar reflex because the stimulus in this case is the tapping of the patella, and you try to basically stretch the patellar tendon. So you want to see that when you stretch the patellar tendon, do you activate the stretch receptors in your quadriceps fast enough, right? So when we tap the patellar ligament or the patellar tendon, it should excite the muscle spindles in the quadriceps muscles. If there is some kind of neurological damage, that might not happen. And then a neurologist would know, okay, we need to do some more heavy-duty investigation on this. So here's the patellar ligament, and it's really a patellar ligament. So when you tap the patellar ligament, it activates these special spindles that we spoke about and excites the muscle spindles and the quadriceps muscles. This could be the rectus femoris. What then happens is sensory neurons transmit that information to the spinal cord, right? Of course, the cell body of that stretch receptor was in a dorsal root ganglion. An interneuron inside the gray matter of the spinal cord basically made decisions, right? It's communicating with this motor neuron over here. You have two motor neurons specifically. You have a purple and a blue motor neuron. The orange was the interneuron. And you're going to tell the motor neurons to cause the quadriceps to contract. And that's going to extend the knee. So step one, you tap the patella with a reflex hammer at the patellar ligament. That should activate stretch receptors in the quadriceps muscles. A sensory neuron goes from the spindle to the spinal cord. An interneuron gets that message, sends it to a motor neuron, which then goes back to the quadriceps and causes it to contract and extend the knee. A side point, just extra information, what's also happening is the interneurons are making another neuron inhibit the hamstrings from contracting. So remember, this is the antagonist. So it's inhibiting the antagonist while activating the agonist. That's what this stimulus is doing. When you tap the patellar ligament, you're causing the quadriceps to contract, which will extend the knee, while the interneurons prevent the hamstrings from resisting the contraction. So again, this is repeating myself a little bit, right? We said the interneuron in the gray matter integrates the stimulus. And this is important. This whole patellar reflex is important because if you were standing up, right, this reflex will help you maintain posture and prevent you from falling over. So if you were to ever stretch your quadriceps or if you were to hit your patellar ligament, you would be able to catch yourself and pick yourself back up instead of just toppling over. So this is making sure that your body can perceive any stretch of the muscle spindles, right, and fix that posture so you can safely move. So now is a good time to pause. The next part talks about the autonomic nervous system, which is mostly covered in chapter 15. And again, this is going to be a very brief overview of chapter 15. Okay, so now we're ready for the final part of this talk. We're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system, the ANS. And the ANS, in my opinion, is a little tricky to understand when you first learn it. It's one of those things that after you go through it like 3 times, then it starts clicking. So for that reason, you might want to watch this crash course first before even reading the slides or even going through the book. And that's up to you. So a brief introduction. So the ANS is the motor nervous system that controls our glands, our cardiac muscle, and our smooth muscle. So basically our internal organs and our glands are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Since they're all internal, right, and it's motor, things are moving in there, it's also called the visceral motor system. So if you remember the first talk we had in the nervous system, we said that there's the visceral motor system and the sensory motor system. And within the motor system, you can have either the visceral or the somatic. So somatic motor system is everything we spoke about with like muscle contraction. Those are the voluntary movements. But the visceral motor system is all involuntary. So the autonomic nervous system is independent of our will. Autonomic means self-governed, literally. So it's doing its own thing. So it's the motor nervous system that does its own thing without us even being aware. So the things it does vary between like heart rate. So the autonomic nervous system is responsible for increasing your heart rate or decreasing your heart rate. Also your blood pressure, as well as your body temperature. So these are all homeostatic mechanisms, making sure that we're in the right type of biological balance needed for life. So the autonomic nervous system is doing this without us even being aware of it. And an American physiologist, Walter Cannon, coined the terms homeostasis and fight or flight when he studied the autonomic nervous system in the late 20th century. Or late 19th century, early 20th century. And he is responsible for a lot of the early information we now know about the autonomic nervous system. He specifically studied animals, and he would see that without an autonomic nervous system, they were not be able to survive. They had no instincts. He had to see that animals without a autonomic nervous system had to be kept warm in like an incubator, and they had to be kept under very low stress conditions because they had no internal way of regulating their thermoregulation, like their warmth and their stress response. So us animals rely on our autonomic nervous system to keep us in check, to keep us in homeostasis without us even being aware of it. And it's a requirement for our survival, right? We can't always have to think, oh, now I have to increase my temperature by 2 degrees. If I'm thinking about that, and the time it takes me to think about that, I might get eaten by a wolf, right? So you have to give some of the work away to your autonomic nervous system so you can focus on what matters in terms of survival. So speaking of a wolf, we said when you're being chased by something, the first thing is that you're going to be aware of it. So the sensory division will sense this wolf. So let's say the sensory receptors of your eye. So your retina will pick up the light being refracted off of this wolf, and your brain is then going to process that information saying, that looks like a wolf. I remember that my sister was eaten by a wolf. I should run away. So then the motor division, back in the peripheral nervous system, then branches off. We have our conscious control of our skeletal muscles telling us to run away. That's the somatic nervous system. But the autonomic nervous system is controlling our cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands that make sure we have enough energy to run and that we're having enough oxygen, right? Basically the requirements that we need for our skeletal muscles to voluntarily move. So this is what we're going to talk about in the rest of the talk, is the autonomic nervous system. And we said its goal is to maintain homeostasis in response to internal changes or something that happens in the external environment. So unconsciously, we're regulating blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, so the rate of breathing, digestion, sweating, dilation of pupils, and sexual response. So all of these things are unconsciously regulated by the autonomic nervous system. And we know that there are 2 subdivisions. We have the sympathetic division, which is known as fight or flight. So this is when something dangerous happens or something that requires your attention. You're going to either have to run away and seek shelter, or you're going to have to muster up your energy and fight and attack. The parasympathetic division is the rest and digest, or feed and breed division. So this is where you're relaxing and processing your food. This is where mating happens. You're not focusing on danger, right? You only want to be eating or breeding when you're in non-dangerous conditions, right? If there's a wolf chasing you, it's not a good time to grab a pizza. So you have to focus on escaping first. So the sympathetic division usually takes priority in fight or flight. And this is not from this book. This is from a different book, but I like this image. It's very clear. So you could refer back to this as we continue to talk. It looks a little confusing at first, but it'll make a lot more sense once you finish these slides. And these 2 divisions are not only structurally different, so there actually are different connections for the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic. But there are also different neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters that are being sent across these synapses are different in the parasympathetic versus sympathetic subdivisions. One of the most confusing aspects of the autonomic system is how they transmit neurotransmitters and how they go through these ganglia, as I mentioned in this talk. So what we spoke about in chapter 12, and mostly chapter 12, is the somatic pathway. A motor neuron will go from the central nervous system, and that neuron is myelinated. This is a peripheral, this is from the spinal nerve, and then this will secrete a neurotransmitter that will bind to the acetylcholine receptors, which will then allow sodium in, depolarize the muscle, and cause it to contract, for example. So in this case, you have a neuron that reaches all the way, the axon of that neuron reaches all the way to the skeletal muscle. The neurotransmitter is released into the synaptic cleft directly by the effector, right? This case is the skeletal muscle. So in the somatic pathway, a motor neuron that's myelinated extends from the central nervous system to so in this case, the spinal cord, directly to the effector muscle, in this case, the skeletal muscle. The ANS is different. In the autonomic pathway, the signal must travel across two different neurons to get to the target organ. And it must cross a synapse where the two neurons meet and an autonomic ganglion. So an autonomic ganglion is shown here in yellow. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But remember, a ganglion is a clump of neuronal cell bodies. So there are two neurons, like I mentioned. The first neuron is called the presynaptic neuron because it's before the synapse. The presynaptic neuron is the first neuron, and it has its cell body in the central nervous system. So it's either in the spinal cord or the brain stem. So the presynaptic neuron goes from the central nervous system to the ganglion. There, at the ganglion, it will synapse with the postganglionic neuron. This is an unmyelinated fiber. And this postganglionic neuron has an axon that goes to the target cell. At the target cell, there will be the neurotransmitter release, which will then bind to certain receptors on those effector cells, and then will cause them to either open and allow sodium in, cause a different ion in, cause some other kind of action. But in this case, we're talking about usually dilating, like opening up blood vessels, or closing blood vessels, or contracting muscle, or relaxing muscle. Those are those are the actions that these neurotransmitters will do. They're going to open up channels on the membrane, allowing things to get in or out, roughly speaking. That's a generalization. And again, the same as, so with sympathetic or parasympathetic, you always have a pre-ganglionic fiber and a post-ganglionic fiber. You'll notice that there's a bit of a difference in the ganglion of a sympathetic pathway versus the parasympathetic pathway. So take note of these differences right now. You can pause and just see what's different between these two. But I'm going to explain that in just a bit. And so this is the three-way comparison. So we need to be unconsciously monitoring our visceral organs to see how full they are, for example. So let's say we want to measure, we want to be able to see how full our intestines are. It's a random example I just came up with now. So we have sensory neurons that are connected to the intestines that go through the posterior root of the spinal cord into an interneuron, which is in the gray matter of the spinal cord. So we have sensory neurons that link up to the gray matter of the spinal cord that are detecting how full our intestines are. That sensory neuron, of course, has its cell body in the posterior ganglion of the spinal cord. But what's happening is, suppose that now in response to how full it is, it has to start moving. It's very full. This intestine is very full, so it has to start moving. So what's going to happen is an interneuron will then signal for a motor nerve impulse to be sent to the effector. But for that to happen, it needs to go through two neurons. So there's the preganglionic neuron. There, it synapses with an autonomic ganglion, right? And then it goes to the postganglionic axon, and then we'll reach the organ again, where it can tell it to contract or to increase contraction. So I'm going to go through that again. I didn't do the best job with that. So when a visceral sensory nerve, right, like this. So this is a nerve, and this is specifically, these are neurons that are detecting how full this intestine is. So suppose this intestine is very full. So it has to tell the central nervous system, it has to tell the spinal cord to increase contraction. So what it does is the first impulse is sent along the sensory axon to the interneurons in the spinal cord. An interneuron within the spinal cord will then relay that message to a motor neuron, and that motor neuron will then send the signal in two parts. There's a preganglionic axon that synapses at the autonomic ganglion with a postganglionic axon, which will then reach the effector organ, right? And this will then achieve an unconscious response. And I'm going to go through another example of this in the Barrow reflex. And this is an example you should know specifically. This might come up on the exam, like this specific example. So suppose we have high blood pressure. We can't consciously think about lowering our blood pressure, right? Our blood pressure is high, but what happens is our body automatically will lower it using a autonomic reflex or a visceral reflex. So this is an autonomic reflex arc. So let's start in the heart. So let's say there's high blood pressure. It will activate a special receptor called a baroreceptor. Baroreceptor means pressure receptor. So high blood pressure will activate these baroreceptors in the carotid arteries and the aorta. And in response to increased blood pressure, this will transmit a signal via the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is one of the cranial nerves. And it will reach the medulla, which is part of the brainstem. And the medulla will then integrate that information from the baroreceptor with other information from the brain about the body. And it will then tell a different nerve, right? There's an interneuron that links the glossopharyngeal nerve with the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is another cranial nerve. And the vagus nerve will then send this message back to the heart, sending inhibitory signals, telling the heart to stop beating so fast, right? We don't need this increased blood pressure. The vagus nerve will slow down the heart and reduce the blood pressure. And thus, we just completed the whole homeostatic negative feedback loop, right? So high blood pressure, this is sensory information sent along the glossopharyngeal nerve to the medulla, where an interneuron will integrate that information, send it to the vagus nerve, which has motor functions in this case. And of course, it doesn't link directly to the heart, right? It has to go to a ganglion first. And then after that ganglion, this motor neuron over here will transmit some type of neurotransmitter, which will slow down the heart rate. We have a separate autonomic reflex when the when the blood pressure drops below normal, too. So we have both types of responses. So that's the baro reflex, the pressure reflex, blood pressure reflex. So just to review, we said that autonomic nervous system signals through the autonomic ganglia, which are clusters of cell bodies. We have the first neuron, which is the preganglionic neuron, has its cell body in the central nervous system. Usually that's either the brainstem or the spinal cord. And it has an axon that reaches the autonomic ganglion. So just to show you a picture, right, we said the preganglionic neuron has its cell body in the CNS and an axon that reaches the autonomic ganglion. The second neuron, the postganglionic neuron, has its cell body inside the autonomic ganglion and an axon that goes to the visceral muscle. And in the case of the baroreflex, we said that baroreceptors in the aorta, this is the aorta in this case, is sending information along the glossopharyngeal nerve to the cardiac regulatory center of the medulla, that's gray matter of the medulla. There we have an interneuron communicating through the spinal cord to the motor pathway. This is the visceral motor pathway. So the preganglionic neuron has its cell body in the gray matter in the CNS and an axon that reaches an autonomic ganglion. Then we have the postganglionic neuron over here that has its cell body inside the autonomic ganglion and an axon that goes to the muscle. Two things you will notice. So try to pause here and think about what's different between this baroreflex I just showed and this one. So there's a little difference. I want to see if we can detect it. This one, just for example, this talks about the increase of how to increase blood pressure. Right, so this is in response to increasing. This is in response to low blood pressure. Right, it goes through a different pathway. You don't have to be familiar with that, but I want you to understand. So what I'm saying is the autonomic ganglion for sympathetic action, right, when you want to increase your blood pressure, that's a sympathetic action. So in that case, the sympathetic pathways go through autonomic ganglia that are part of the sympathetic chain. And I'm going to talk about this in the next slide. But I just want you to note how this is different. When we're trying to increase heart rate, that's a sympathetic pathway. So it goes through a different ganglia. Goes through different ganglia than when you want to try to slow down heart rate. That's parasympathetic. So the ganglion is very close to the organ in parasympathetic. And again, this is one of those things where once you might be confused right now, but once you go through the remainder of the slides and watch this over again, I promise you it'll make a lot more sense. Because I don't want to reveal too much information without going through the next couple of slides. And I will remind you that the book goes into a lot more detail than this. So now we'll talk about the sympathetic branch in more detail, which is the fight or flight response in response to any stress or danger, but also exercise. And we need to increase our heart rate and respiration. So think about why. Why do we really need to increase our respiration? So pause the video if you need to and think about it. Right, so we need fuel to run. In order to get fuel to run, that's ATP, we need to break down glucose. In order to do that most efficiently, we need oxygen. So we need to breathe very heavily, and we need to deliver that oxygen throughout our body. And the better way to deliver it is with increased heart rate. We'll get better oxygen delivery throughout the body, right, if we increase our heart rate. So we can get maximum ATP production, maximum efficiency, right, of our skeletal muscles. We're going to increase our blood pressure, decrease our digestion, right? We don't want to be wasting our energy on processing a hamburger we ate when we have to run away. Also, it produces sweat to help cool us down as we accelerate or as we use up a lot of energy. So it's like a built-in cooling fan, right? We start sweating when we use a lot of energy. Also, our pupils and bronchioles dilate. So our pupils dilate. That means our eyes are able to accommodate farther vision. We could see farther away. So we could see a predator or some other threat. And our bronchioles dilate in our lungs so we could get as much oxygen as possible. And finally, blood is directed to skeletal muscles away from the viscera, so we can get our arms and legs moving so we can run away from the threat or towards the threat if we choose to fight. So that's the fight or flight response. In addition, the fight or flight response triggers the release of epinephrine from the adrenal glands. So those are quite a ways from the brain. So those are on the top of the kidneys. We have adrenal glands, and that triggers the release. The adrenal glands release the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine, which can act on the liver cells and break down glycogen into glucose, for example, among other activities that will help stimulate the fight or flight response. Right? This gives us that adrenaline rush feeling that actually comes from the adrenal glands, hence the adrenaline rush. So now I'm going to go into a little more detail about the sympathetic nervous system, and then you can look back about a few slides ago when I was talking about heart rate to try to make the connections I was hinting at. The sympathetic nervous system is also called the thoracolumbar division, because it arises from the thoracic and lumbar portions of the spinal cord. So the cervical region is not connected to the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system arises from the thoracic in blue and the lumbar regions of the spinal cord. These have very short, the sympathetic division has relatively short preganglionic fibers, which are in green, and long postganglionic fibers. And that's because their cell bodies, the preganglionic cell bodies, the preganglionic neurosomas, and the spinal cord are connected to what are called the sympathetic chain of ganglia. So this whole thing is called a sympathetic chain of ganglia. And we have two of these, sympathetic chain of ganglia. It's a series of ganglia that lie adjacent to both sides of the vertebral column, all the way from the cervical region all the way to the coccyx. And these are all ganglia, so they're just clumps of nerve bodies. They're connected by nerve cords. And we have, again, so our preganglionic neurosomas go from the spinal cord, the gray matter in the spinal cord, to this ganglia. They're very short because the ganglion are very close to the spinal cord. Each of these ganglia is then connected to a spinal nerve. So these are connected to a spinal nerve, that will then send the ganglionic neuron, which is very long, right, to the specific region of the body that needs to be stimulated. So in the case of the heart, the signal went from the medulla to the spinal cord to the autonomic ganglia, where it's synapsed with the postganglionic motor fiber that will then go directly to the heart and release neurotransmitters to increase the rate of heart contraction to raise the blood pressure. So that's sympathetic action. So this is a very long postganglionic fiber for sympathetic action, because the autonomic ganglion, where the presynaptic neuron goes, is very short. So you have short connection here, but a very long connection in the postganglionic neuron because it's sympathetic. So again, it's a little confusing at first, and it's amazing to think about how this is in our body, right? And the best way, at least for me, to understand this is just think about your own body. When you're trying to, when you see a threat to something and you need to raise your blood pressure, think about what's actually happening inside your own body. So like your spinal cord is connected to your brain, which is connected to your heart. So your heart will detect something, which will then tell your brain, tell your spinal cord, and then it will monitor that through these autonomic ganglia. So we have all these autonomic ganglia that are right outside of our spinal cord. And that's where it's like the intermediary between the spinal cord and the spinal nerve. Each of these ganglion is connected to a spinal nerve that will then go to the heart or the lungs or the digestive system or the reproductive system or the eyes, for example. So you might want to stop here to watch this crash course video that will review some of the sympathetic nervous system. I'm actually not even requiring you to know every single detail in that video, but you should know 90% of that based on what's covered in this slide, in these slides. So the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is the rest and digest, or the feed and breed response. So this is where we need to sleep and relax. We need to decrease our heart rate, right? Decrease respiration, decrease our blood pressure. This is where we want to increase our digestive organs to process the food. We don't want to be sweating. Our pupils are constricted, right? They're not dilated. Our bronchioles are constricted. They're not dilated. And our blood is routed to our digestive organs so we can digest. So that's the rest and digest response. The parasympathetic division is also called the craniosacral division because it arises from the brainstem, the cranial part, and the sacral regions of the spinal cord. Right, so you should test yourself. Where was the sympathetic nervous system? Right, so that was the thoracolumbar. Thoracolumbar. The parasympathetic is craniosacral. And unlike the sympathetic division, these have very, very long very long preganglionic fibers. And they end in a terminal ganglia. And a terminal ganglia, I'll give the example of the heart, which is very close to or inside of the target organ. So this is very different than what we saw before. So with parasympathetic nerve stimulation, we have a long preganglionic fiber that meets a ganglion that's very close to or inside of the target organ. And there's a very, very short postganglionic neuron that will then stimulate the effector cells of that organ. So there's still two neurons involved. There's still a ganglion in the middle. But in parasympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic stimulation, the ganglion is very far away from the spinal cord. And that also should make sense, right? We don't need rapid stimulation. It could be farther away from the spinal cord if we want to calm things down. For sympathetic stimulation, we want immediate action. So for that, it's more important for the ganglia to be closer to the spinal cord for immediate action. For parasympathetic, we're more laid back about it. So we have very long presynaptic, preganglionic fibers and very short postganglionic fibers that are almost only within the target organ. So here's that crash course video. And just to think about, again, how I showed you the heart, we said that there's sensory information going to the cardiac centers of the medulla from the glossopharyngeal nerve. So the glossopharyngeal nerve has a sensory function that goes from the heart. It's then going to tell the medulla what's going on. The medulla will then send an interneuron and then will tell the vagus nerve, which is the motor neuron in this case. The vagus nerve will then go to a ganglion that's in the heart. The vagus nerve goes from the brain all the way down to the heart, to the chest. So it's a very long preganglionic fiber. And then it reaches the ganglion that's in the heart. And then the postganglionic fibers will then tell the effector cells to, well, what will really happen is they're going to release a neurotransmitter that will bind to the proper types of receptor, which will then decrease skeletal muscle contraction, or sorry, cardiac muscle contraction. Right? These are cardiac muscles. So in response to the vagus nerve will talk to the ganglion, which will then talk to the postganglionic fibers, which will then release a neurotransmitter to the cardiac muscle cells to decrease their contraction. So in the case of the eye, you should know just some examples of what sympathetic stimulation would do compared to parasympathetic. So for the eye, we're dilating the pupil so we can see far. With parasympathetic, we're constricting so we can see near. With sympathetic stimulation, with the heart, we're increasing the rate and strength of contraction. Versus parasympathetic, we're decreasing the rate of heart contraction. With blood and arterioles, with sympathetic, we're constricting our arterioles to increase blood pressure, and we're increasing supply of blood to skeletal muscles. Whereas parasympathetic division, we're decreasing the blood supply to skeletal muscles and increasing the blood supply to our digestive organs so we can digest. And with the lungs, right, we're trying to dilate the bronchioles with sympathetic stimulation so we can get more oxygen, versus with parasympathetic, we're constricting the bronchioles. And in the liver, which has to do with digestion, with sympathetic stimulation, we're decreasing bile production because we don't need to be breaking down fats with bile right now with sympathetic stimulation. We need to increase our blood glucose. We need to break down glycogen into glucose. Versus parasympathetic has the opposite effect, right? We're increasing bile production so we can digest, but we don't care about blood glucose right now, so we're not going to break down glycogen. So those are some examples you should be familiar with. So the last question becomes, how do autonomic neurons have contrasting effects on organs? Right? They're still neurons. So how does one neuron have an effect that will increase contraction while another neuron will have a decreased contraction effect? So how do these neurons have different effects on different organs? That's the question. The answer is there are two fundamental reasons. The first is that sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers each secrete different neurotransmitters. So the two neurotransmitters you should know are norepinephrine and acetylcholine. And we spoke about how those work in 2 lectures ago. So norepinephrine works on adrenergic receptors, as I'm going ahead of myself, and acetylcholine works on cholinergic receptors. Right? Both change something inside of the cell by either, so acetylcholine allows sodium in or allows ions in to depolarize it most of the time, whereas norepinephrine acts through a different kind of receptor with second messengers that cause a cellular change. But neurotransmitters are different between sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation. And also the receptors on target cells are different. So different target cells can respond to the same neurotransmitter differently, depending on the type of receptor they have for it. So on a heart cell, there might be a certain type of receptor that's different than a muscle cell. So when acetylcholine reaches them, it might be the same type of neurotransmitter, but as it reaches different organs, the different organs have different receptors. So they're going to respond differently to the same neurotransmitter. Also, there are different types of receptors for each neurotransmitter. So even though acetylcholine is released, right, one receptor there's different types of receptors for acetylcholine on different types of cells. So again, so target cells can respond to the same neurotransmitter differently. And there are 2 different kinds of receptors for acetylcholine and 2 different kinds of receptors for norepinephrine. So there's a lot of different variability you can create with just 2 neurotransmitters. So acetylcholine is secreted by all preganglionic neurons in both the sympathetic nervous division and the parasympathetic nervous division. So let's just look here. Here is our preganglionic fiber releasing acetylcholine in the autonomic ganglion of the sympathetic chain. Here in the parasympathetic motor division, we have another myelinated preganglionic fiber releasing acetylcholine in the parasympathetic ganglion, which is very close to the heart. Right? These axons are called cholinergic fibers, and the receptors in the receptors of the postganglionic fiber are called cholinergic receptors. So acetylcholine can have excitatory or inhibitory effects depending on the specific type of cholinergic receptor. You have different kinds of cholinergic receptors and the type of cell. So when acetylcholine binds to a heart muscle cell, it might be different than a skeletal muscle cell. And again, you won't have to be responsible for this, but there are different kinds of cholinergic receptors that are either inhibitory or excitatory when acetylcholine binds. And cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and skeletal muscle have different distributions of different cholinergic receptors. Then we have norepinephrine, and that is secreted by nearly all sympathetic postganglionic neurons. So norepinephrine acts on the cardiac muscle cells in this case. And these are called adrenergic fibers because they are stimulated by adrenaline or secrete adrenaline. And the heart muscle, the cardiac muscle, will have adrenergic receptors, right, that respond to the norepinephrine. And there are different types of receptors. So alpha adrenergic receptors are usually excitatory, so they'll usually increase heart contraction, where beta adrenergic receptors are usually inhibitory. So depending on the type of cell, different types of cells have an abundance of either beta adrenergic receptors or alpha adrenergic receptors. So they have different effects, right, depending on the type of cell it is. So that's, I won't go into more detail because you won't have to memorize it, but know that when norepinephrine is released into the blood, you can increase your increase contraction of certain muscles while decreasing contraction of other muscles based on the types of receptors each of those cells has. So what does the sympathetic division of the ANS do? This is very easy. So you can pause here. Right, so the answer is D. Right, we're preparing the body for fight or flight. What does the parasympathetic division do? And again, the answer is D. So you should be able to make a diagram that contains all of the structural and functional divisions of the nervous system. So central nervous system, what that includes, peripheral nervous system, what that includes, everything down to sympathetic and parasympathetic division. So this is what you should be able to think about just in your head. I'm not going to talk about any more diseases because you have an assignment based on that and a guest lecture. A little bit about stress management. So stress is a response of the sympathetic nervous system. And that's almost our default, right? It's very easy to trigger our sympathetic nervous system. We get nervous easily, we get startled by things. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of reason to be anxious now more than ever. So we have to actively trigger our parasympathetic branch. Because even with exercise, when we exercise, we're still activating our sympathetic branch of the ANS. So it's very hard to relax, where it's very easy to get upset. So in order to help activate the parasympathetic division, you should do what makes you relax the most, which can be maybe connecting with nature or connecting with people that you care about. But also meditation is an increasingly effective way to activate your parasympathetic nervous system. And I'm no expert by any means, but one great app that has really helped me is called Headspace. You've probably heard of it now. It got very popular over the past year or so. But in class, I was going to do a little survey about what your opinion on meditation is. So you can pause if you're interested in looking at the survey questions. But regardless of what your experience is with meditation right now, try to think about what benefits meditation might have on your parasympathetic nervous system. What will be the overall takeaway? What's the point of meditation? All right, so there's several possible answers. And again, I'm not an expert, but these are just some that I thought of. And mostly what we're doing is we're being the observer of our own thoughts, right? Instead of judging our thoughts, right? We're being aware in the present moment without judging what's going on. We're just sitting back and observing instead of getting engaged with the thoughts. Right? Getting engaged with the thoughts activates the sympathetic nervous system, right? That makes your heart rate increase, your blood pressure increase. You're going to start sweating when you think about something that gets you anxious. But by taking a step back and becoming the observer of those anxious thoughts, you're not activating your sympathetic nervous system anymore, right? Your default is to observe and to relax, and that's parasympathetic. So when you're being still, right, you don't attach to anything, because when you attach to other things and you try to reach out for things, when you're trying to think about tough topics, or you're thinking about cravings or expectations, you're engaging with the sympathetic nervous system. So what meditation does is it helps the mind and body coexist in a way. And what it does is you're helping train the mind. By practicing meditation, you're helping train the mind. And I need to do that just as much as everyone else. And some people are really good at it. Some people really excel at this. For some, it requires a lot of practice, just like any sport. There are many, many benefits of meditation and on improving your control of your parasympathetic nervous system. So it allows you to improve your focus and clarity in everyday life, increase your athletic and academic performance, will help you with your relationships, avoid procrastination in work, and give you an overall sense of balance. And of course, your physical health improvement will be probably the most important because you can actually live a longer life with reduced stress. And as a perk, you get to know yourself a little more when you meditate. So a lot of benefits have been proven by research. So all these up here have been proven in research to be directly benefited by meditation. So here's a quick video that I included in the PowerPoint that features one of the many different animations offered by Headspace. This is a good 2-minute one. It's actually a minute. Talks about changing perspective. And this is a good introduction to mindfulness and the Headspace app. So there's a lot of cute little animations that make very abstract concepts a little more easy to digest and kind of fun. So you could watch this one right now. And there's a great student discount. Headspace used to be almost $100 a year, and I think it's a little cheaper now. But with the student discount, it's only $10 a year. And you have access to hundreds of different types of guided meditations and animations and videos that help activate your parasympathetic nervous system. And some overall lessons from meditation is to challenge everything. That's a good lesson from science as well. But always challenge yourself. Right? And you are not your thoughts. You are the observer of your thoughts. And that's, again, when you engage with your thoughts, that's engaging the sympathetic nervous system. And finally, life is too short to be taken too seriously. That's a good lesson, right? Balance is key. Homeostasis is a constant theme in anatomy and physiology, but it's also a theme in life, right? We need to always achieve balance, a biological balance of everything. So there's a time and place for seriousness and a time and place for fun. So with that, that is the end of chapters 13 through 15. And there's actually only one more recording after this that will be on the sensory system. So you have all the information from chapters 12 through 15.